Okay. All right. Well, welcome to this evening's Mansfield College public talk. It's fantastic that there's so many people here, even if you are only virtually here. My name's Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal at Mansfield, for those of you who don't know me. We love having guest speakers to give public talks of general interest, and we love having people into our college. And I'm glad at least that you can see it online, although unfortunately we can't welcome you here this term. I'm particularly sorry that we can't have this evening's speaker here in person, not least because he's only around the corner at Jesus College, but I am delighted to be able to welcome Sir Nigel Shadbolt to give his talk this evening on the digital ape, the title of his book, which is subtitled How to Live at Peace with Smart Machines, something I think we could all do with today. Nigel is the principal of Jesus College, as I've said, and he's also a professorial research fellow in the Department of Computer Science at Oxford. And he's the chairman of the Open Data Institute, which he co-founded with Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And he's one of those very rare people who combines real technical expertise as an interdisciplinary researcher with policy expertise and ability to talk to people like me who don't understand the smart machines, but are struggling to work out how we live at peace with them. So this evening, Nigel's going to take us on a journey showing how the human race's relationship with AI has evolved and is evolving in the first decades of the 21st century. I'm sure you'll have questions as the talk goes on. If you could put those in the Q&A function, then after Nigel's given his talk, I will put those to him. So thank you very much for joining us, Nigel, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to be part of this great public lecture series. So yeah, the title is The Digital Ape, Being Human in the Age of AI. It's basically a transmutation of the title of a book that a colleague and I wrote, Roger Hampson and I wrote in 2018, The Digital Ape, How to Live in Peace with Smart Machines. And in that book, actually, the first thing to say is it was actually an homage to a great book that many people bought back in the 60s. Desmond Morris, again, a formidable public scientist, wrote this book that he reminded us of our primate origins. This rather tantalizing cover graced many people's bookshelves, perhaps still does. Over 50 years ago, 1967, it was first published. And he reminded us that we were primates and that to understand us and our proclivities, it would be good to understand that lineage. And made many fascinating observations from a zoologist's point of view on the kind of state and condition of humans and what everything from their mating habits to their social habits to their cognitive capacities to their emotional and behavioral tendencies. So we really wanted to reflect that in the same way that Morris reflected on our primate origins, how did that relate to our technical trajectory, our technical evolution? So here we have a rather lovely reconstruction of one of our distant forebears. This is Australopithecus afarensis, they were walking the African continent well over 3 million years ago. In fact, recently discovered was this extraordinary ancient simple tool, this very basic hand axe, which appears to be 3.3 million years old. Now, the remarkable thing about that, and what we're learning more and more, is this continuity of technological evolution. What that tells us is that 200,000 generations before this species appears on the scene, modern humans, we were shaping technology, we were evolving technology. And more to the point, clearly that technological advance was huge. I mean, the beautiful stone implements that early and later Homo sapiens were able to develop were quite extraordinary. But those precursors had been shaping us. So it's not that we invented our technology exclusively. In some sense, our technology also shaped us. It's well illustrated in the work of Dietrich Stout, who's actually undergone a whole series of studies, taken a whole series of studies looking at how neural functions change as you move from one stone technology to another. And in this kind of visualization, we can see that the various parts of the brain are activated when different types of stone tool are being developed. And the observation from this work is that more parts of the cortex are activated in the development of later tools than the earlier ones. It seems to be that there may well be a very direct correlation in terms of the complexity of this tool and the neural circuitry being recruited to develop that. So the thought here is that not just our neurology, but our fine control of our hands, the opposition of our thumbs with our fingers, generations upon generations were evolving and adapting to manage this technology. The modern hand axe, in some sense, well, it's been replaced by something rather more specialized, the ubiquitous smartphone we all carry about. Now, this lovely illustration shows us the fundamental chip technology. That's actually a rather distant iPhone generation now, iPhone 8. It's showing us the features that underlie our modern generic technology. Features on the order of 15 nanometers in size. You can pack about 450 of those features into a red blood cell. Again, one of the things that is remarkable about this modern technology is that it is, in some sense, both completely ubiquitous, but remote to us. That not so very long ago, our forebears were capable of generally producing the technology they depended upon. We are now deeply dependent on a whole range of automation, science, technology, material science and engineering to produce the tools that have been the revolutionary guard of the 21st century. And that evolution is quite extraordinary. Again, this is a visualization of what is often known as Moore's law. This is this log linear graph of transistor density, which is a rough approximation to computing power to year of introduction. And we can see that as well, you know, back in 1974, when I was actually off to my first university degree, the Motorola 6800 had 4,100 transistors. And the A12 Bionic chip that was powering many people's Apple phones has 6.9 billion. The exponents of technological engineering have transformed our world in ways that actually it's even hard for those of us who research the discipline to anticipate, and I'll perhaps come back to that. The exponents of our technology are producing quite extraordinary results, such that any slide you produce is more or less out of date the moment you produce it. This is actually the state of the art. Currently, the A13 has 8.5 billion transistors, has started to factor out all sorts of specialist chips inside that single chip to manage automated machine learning, particularly fast graphics processing and so on. All of this at levels that are absolutely stunning. So those 450 components inside a red blood cell, now we're talking about more or less 900. And those exponents have occurred in every aspect of our computing technology. This is a log linear plot of memory density, known as Kreider's law. It's shown that the extraordinary capacity for us to lay down digital memory has been just as explosive as the raw processing speed, as has communication speed between devices, Cooper's law, and on and on. And what this, of course, does is periodically, this extraordinary increase in power presents us with shocks, because the brute force and whatever insight we bring to our programming of these extraordinary technologies disrupts the situation where we've long believed human capacity was beyond anything that a machine could emulate. In 1997, when Garry Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue, there were all sorts of concerns around the machines taking our jobs. AI was about to take over and wake up. It was an existential threat to humanity. We better look out. And that was partly because the sheer size of the problem that's to be tackled when you try and play a game of chess to any advanced level seemed truly extraordinary, beyond what any machine could reasonably attempt or manage. Millions upon millions of moves to be calculated, and that was because the branching factor of a game of chess halfway through is on the order of 30 or so, and that gives you search spaces that are very, very large. But at the point at which Deep Blue was playing Kasparov, there was an opportunity for those machines to be searching hundreds of millions of board positions a second and using rough evaluation functions to work out what strong positions were. And in some real sense, Kasparov, as he writes very powerfully in his book on this, was unnerved by the capability of the system, to the extent that he began to imagine it had a capability to foresee that was not in any sense in the system, but its performance was the level that led him to believe that it could endow it with actual cognitive capability. That brute force continued from 97 all the way through to 20 years later. We're in a situation in which this search tree, this is the branching tree for a game of Go, led to a very similar looking state of despair on the face of Lee Sedol. This was the AlphaGo deep learning system defeating the world's strongest Go player. And at the same time, we've had all sorts of concerns around whether this presaged the demise of humanity. The AIs were going to variously wake up and do away with us. Now, I want to reflect a little bit. One of the other things we talk about in the book is this move, these pivot points when we have seen a technology really transform society. And we might move back to the Agrarian Revolution, the use of ploughing technology. We might think of the Gutenberg press, the availability suddenly of crops at scale reliably, or printed books at scale. More recently, of course, the Industrial Revolution, and seems an age ago in some respects, but the opening of the Olympics when Tim Berners-Lee tweeted out, this is for everyone, the ubiquity of access to our underlying technology. And that ubiquity of access is something that has been particularly striking about the digital revolution. Many of our previous revolutions were about trying to manage the allocation of increasing, but nevertheless, in some sense, limited resources which simply didn't reproduce in the way that information reproduces. And information, of course, has reproduced via agencies such as the web. This is the extraordinary kind of counts we now see just in terms of the number of websites. You might think the entire world is now connected to the web. Actually, there's a very substantial part of the human population who don't have access to this fundamental, powerful technology. And it's not as if it is entirely balanced in other respects as well. If we see regional development areas, access to the internet, or look at it in terms of gender, there are some very significant structural disequities in place as we move through the first part of the 21st century. And one has to ask, whilst we're all kind of exploring the opportunity of these technologies, there are some fundamental challenges around equity of access. And this will turn out to be material in AI, because the algorithms, the data, the machines themselves, it isn't as if they are universally distributed or available at scale to everyone. This is a great credit photo to Adam Cohen, who actually shows, you know, this is so often what's seen in some of the developing world. The other thing, of course, it's a mobile phenomenon. Increasingly, our access to data is through our mobile technology. So the evolution of those iPhones, the technology underpinning them, the applications they run, the Android phones, the whole range of smartphone technology is material, because it is that infrastructure that is increasingly capturing the data and delivering the services which are powered in many, many cases by AI technology. And let's consider that for a moment. In my team in Oxford in the Department of Computer Science, we were recently running a study on just trying to understand, given this infrastructure, given the ubiquity of the mobile phone, what could we understand about where the data was? This actually turns out to be a very hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer because it isn't easy to get hold of all the apps on the various platforms and analyze them from where the data goes. Sometimes the providers of those app stores simply aren't prepared to do that. If you do, if you go to something like the Android Play Store, which is where the apps for the Android ecosystem live, well, you can get hold of the apps. In fact, in this work, we downloaded over 1 million of them, and we tried to do a range of analysis to simulate where data was flowing on the various apps. Now, that's a very intensive process, different techniques and methods you can use. And in this work, we threw a whole range of these at them to get a sense of what data concentration looked like in this world, and indeed, who was tracking that data as it passed through your phone in the various applications. Here's a nice image we used from that work. This is one application running on a platform on your phone. This is an Airbnb application, and you're seeing there the information flowing out with a range of other applications on the phone, eBay, Instagram, Tinder, etc. And you're seeing the categories of information that are acting as intermediaries. So your course location, your personal details, phone characteristics, your phone ID, where you more precisely are. Who's that being forwarded on to? Well, various intermediaries, Google themselves, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, a range of click-through services that are managing and moderating and noticing where data is flowing, for functionality reasons, for marketing reasons, and a bunch of others. But you and I have no real sense of that flow of information. And indeed, the regulators find it hard to come up with any such visualizations. What this speaks to is the fact that there are entire aspects of our digital ecosystem which are below the surface. They're not available to us to particularly control, and it's very hard to come to a considered view of whether or not double-click acquiring some other company is going to lead to an unreasonable market concentration in terms of data flow analysis. How can you regulate a market if you don't understand the underlying dynamics of that world? So this kind of analysis, just tracking where the actual information is, what the functionality of the modern smartphone is in terms of data flows, presents research problems and research challenges in its own right. We actually wrote this up a few years ago, and it created a bit of a stir. I mean, not least amongst some of the platforms who believed that this was not a fair reflection of how they were using their data, but nevertheless, it's absolutely clear this is a significant challenge. And the reason, of course, is that so many of the AI algorithms that concern us nowadays are using the raw data that these systems generate as their feedstock. People like Shoshana Zuboff have written about this in her book, Surveillance Capitalism, extensively, starting to worry about the whole question around how concentrations on a small number of significant platforms present us with real challenges around regulation and equity, around balance of interest. And it's no coincidence, I think, that, of course, many of these companies run large AI groups that are looking to, of course, develop methods and techniques to enhance their services, but also create more opportunity for them as platforms. How we address this is becoming a really material question in the 21st century. So back to AI. So AI is variously defined. One of my favorite definitions, actually, because it often pursues us when we're talking about our subject, is artificial intelligence, the art of making computers that behave like the ones in movies. Well, that's kind of a scary definition on the one hand, because so very often the machines and robots of Hollywood are mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Right back to the wonderful imagining of Kubrick with HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you remember that wonderful part of the film where HAL is actually surveilling Bowman and his colleague as they talk about trying to disconnect the machine. They lock themselves in a pod. They think it's entirely secure. The machine is lip reading their conversation and goes about trying to do away with them both. That kind of model of the machine, in some sense, overwhelming its human creators. And whether it's Terminator or Eva, in Ex Machina, there are a few which are slightly more, if you like, sympathetic renditions of the robot condition, but not always wildly sensible, like Spielberg's AI. This is often an enduring image of what the field of artificial intelligence is all about. In fact, the truth is rather more prosaic, but it's also important to recognize how ubiquitous AI is in our lives now. From its utilization in the latest autonomous vehicles, voice recognition, the kind of intelligence used in delivering up search engine results, or everything from health and telerobotics through to modern climate modeling, AI, machine learning, very much in play. What it isn't is the reflective, sentient, corrupted, demented robot of Hollywood. The original field was defined back in '56. I mean, there had been work well before that, of course, in artificial intelligence. Alan Turing himself had been imagining what the conditions for smart machines might be. But in '56, John McCarthy convened a workshop, the so-called Dartmouth Conference. And the optimism and belief in that group was that really what we needed to do was apply the modern methods of programming and the emerging computer science that was around the time to analyze every aspect of learning or a feature of intelligence in such a way that you could precisely describe it as a set of machine instructions. And back in the day, those methods relied on techniques such as logic-based or rule-based programming. Now, I often show this just to illustrate one very important point about artificial intelligence. In the decades that it has been around, it is not just purely about machine learning. It is not, in particular, just about deep neural networks. There's been a long tradition of different forms of trying to build and produce machines whose behavior is significantly adaptive, that would count as, in some sense, intelligent. Those methods include, for example, rule-based reasoning. So when I was first coming into the field, one of the areas of focus was the construction of what were called expert or knowledge-based systems. And in these systems, you literally codify the world, and this is a very simple example, in terms of rules. These rules can be complicated by the addition of statistical methods, all sorts of interesting ways of accounting for uncertainty in the world. But here's a very simple characterization of an imagined medical application. If a white blood cell count is less than 2,500, then your rule will tell you that was a low white blood cell count. If a temperature is greater than 101, then an individual had a fever. In Fahrenheit, I should say. If there was a low white blood cell count and you had a fever, then you might have a gram-negative infection. And if you had a gram-negative infection, then you might administer penicillin. These chains of rules, rule bases consisting of hundreds, thousands of rules, were the object of a serious effort to build systems over many decades. Those systems, I should say, are deployed to this day. They've been very effective. The rule-based, explicit representation of knowledge about the world still complements many of the AI systems that we use. And this was one of the early systems that I was involved in developing back in the late 80s. This was a system that could take the diagram on the left, which is actually a chemical flow sheet. It specifies the logic for producing a chemical product, and gave you the output on the right. And you can see from the clunky graphics, this must have been around a few decades ago, but it lays out in 3 dimensions a plant capable of realizing the process on the left, represented in rules and constraints, explicit knowledge representation methods. And it was a hard job. You had to take the hard-won expertise of the chemical engineer and turn that into explicit rules to produce the output. But it turned out also to point out the fact that a great deal of what's in the diagram on the left and realized in the diagram on the right is implicit common sense knowledge. The placement of 3 of the containers at the top of the right-hand diagram is a recognition that to get the products in those tanks to another part of the plant, you're going to rely on gravity flow. There is nothing in the diagram on the left that tells you that's what you're going to do. Gravity flow ensures that liquids flow from one place to the other because of the difference in height. Completely tacit, implied piece of information. And one of the discoveries and insights from those early experiments in AI was just how much of the world was expressed in terms of this common sense rule-based reasoning, and the huge effort that was put into capturing common sense knowledge defined many decades of work in artificial intelligence. A very different model, always from the outset, that inspired AI was to look at actual nervous systems in biology. Animals, humans display intelligence. Perhaps we should be looking not in terms of formulating behaviors as rules, but at the actual underlying hardware that generated behavior in these systems. So-called biologically inspired robotics and biologically inspired AI took these models seriously and attempted to try and build simple neural networks. Once again, back in the 1990s, 2000s, I was working with a colleague where we were using models inspired by the way in which real neurons were connected and how they competed to strengthen or weaken their connections between one another, which seems to be a key feature of adaptation and learning in nervous systems. We were taking those models and implementing them on small robots. In fact, a paper we wrote, Developmental Robotics, tried to show how these methods, rooted in neuroscience, could be realized in hardware. How you could take very simple networks, and here we have very simple networks connected. So the diagram on the left shows you the wiring between the left motor neuron. The bottommost circle there is an abstraction of a cell which is going to drive the speed of a motor, connected through an intermediate layer to a top layer which represents the infrared sensors around the skirt of that robot I showed you. So if we look at the small robot, a so-called Kepler robot, it's got a little ring of stubby sensors around the base. And the challenge with our neural network was to learn the connection weights between the input and the motor speed to avoid objects, to avoid collisions. That style of programming defined a very different way of thinking about how to do adaptive, how to build adaptive systems. All the time, remember, this world is being disrupted by the exponents of change, by increasing amounts of compute power that allows you to connect essentially many, many more layers of artificial neurons together, such that we now live in a world of so-called deep neural networks, where layer on layer on layer of network can be built, really exploiting the efficiencies of modern computing architectures. The fact that Moore's law has kept giving us more powerful compute speeds, faster connect speeds, And we have now the situation where the learning that can be achieved with these systems is really quite extraordinary. It leads to the defeat of the world's strongest Go player. It leads to systems that are able to play multi-user games to a level that is regarded as expert. It leads to systems that can recognize and accurately classify from images a range of potential threatening conditions, such as, in this case, various forms of skin cancer. It can recognize from the image of a retinal scan whether or not the subject's suffering from a particular condition. Networks that have been trained on thousands and thousands of examples and can find the patterns in the data and express them as weights between layers in the neural network. A very different way of representing knowledge than our rule-based system. In many cases, we complement these elements together, rule-based and neural network machine learning systems. And the challenge, of course, is that these networks express their capabilities as weights in very large arrays. And what kind of explanation does a system operating in that way give you? Well, what it does give you is extraordinary performance. It's ironic that we come back to the HAL example. I mentioned the robot that was able to read lips. We now have neural network systems that are capable of reading human lips to a high degree of accuracy. That we have systems capable of recognizing millions and millions of faces from the training examples they're given. And they're done this a variety of ways in which these networks are trained, but essentially the presentation of examples and feeding through layer on layer of the network and feeding back corrections when particular classifications are either accurate or inaccurate allow these systems to adjust themselves to achieve tasks to high levels of capability. Now, it's important to say that these systems are not infallible. And one of the things about the modern neural network that's very intriguing is that if you take two neural networks and have one try and spoof the other, so these are so-called generalized adversarial networks, you can come up with some really interesting insights. So systems that might be trained to recognize a bubble or a peacock, given thousands and thousands of images that they learn to label correctly. Another network trying to produce an input that the first network confidently misclassifies shows us that what's being recognized in those images is not necessarily what we as humans extract. So there's an example here from a system that was able to have a trained system that was achieving high accuracy in predicting image types, confidently predict that the image in the lower left was a bubble and the image in the lower right was a peacock. What they're seeing in the image, what they're actually abstracting out, is not always necessarily anything consistent or close to what the human cognitive system is extracting. So always in these systems, we have to understand and trade off an appreciation of how the system is operating, what knowledge is being recruited to help it achieve its end. Of course, the other thing that we have to take notice of is that in this world, the increasing power of computing, the brute force capability, the increasing ability to miniaturize our electronics, our mechanics, is giving rise at last to devices which have rather compelling characteristics. And whether it's a humanoid robot, this one from Boston Dynamics, we are giving this real sense that systems are becoming more and more capable. And of course, the natural concern is, well, at what point do these systems become weaponized? What are the purposes for which these capabilities are being developed? What are they being put to? And it's easy and quite obviously important to ask the question, how does the technology get deployed? weaponization of AI is currently a serious item for discussion. People have almost realized very late in the day that computing is a dual-use technology in the same way that chemical science, biological science, nuclear science was used for peaceable as well as not so peaceable deployments. It has always been the case in computer science that that has been there, but we're seeing it materialize very directly in the recruitment and claims for what AI might do in this field. Other areas where the developments in AI give us pause for concern, of course, one that is very prevalent at the moment is this whole issue of privacy and surveillance. And I alluded to it in the context of large data monopolies, the work of Zhubov and others, and our work on data flows. Again, a colleague and I, a number of years ago, wrote a book, Spy and the Coffee Machine, which imagined and anticipated a world in which I'm afraid we find ourselves much more rapidly than I ever expected. A world in which devices are capable of surveilling us and are capable of producing analysis of patterns of life in a way that is really quite extraordinary. Those devices have in many cases been invited directly into our homes. Those devices are likely to be engineered into more and more of the devices around us. And the question naturally arises, who has access to that data? What are the purposes? Are we confident that we have the norms and regulations and laws in place that we need to manage this emerging world? And we're seeing really interesting discussions in the public sphere on this. Caroline Criado-Perez's book, Invisible Women, actually talks to the issue that it's not just the mode of deployment of these algorithms or systems, it's the fact that the data they're fed with in the first place can in many cases contain deep and significant bias, may be collected in ways that are representative of a situation which does not at all represent the interests of significant parts of the population or demography. And we see this at every level. We're seeing it in concerns right now about the way in which AI is being used in health contexts to analyze and segment various health demographics. There's always been a concern, I should say, around the elimination of jobs by automation. It's quite interesting that that periodically seems to be a trope that comes around about every, well, here's a number of front covers from Der Spiegel where the machines were always about to take all of your jobs. Prior to the pandemic, our view was that this was a much more nuanced and complicated situation than we might have thought, that humans had been very effective at finding things for themselves to do for which they were willing to pay each other wages. Of course, in an age where so many of the assumptions around secure employment may be under challenge, we'll see how that goes. But again, I have not necessarily ever considered that to be the foremost threat of AI. Rather more, the consideration that I think we have to give is to one rooted in the ethical principles that need to underpin the way in which our technology is deployed, our algorithms used, our data recruited. The Kantian principle is one that I've always been struck by, which is the notion that we should think of ourselves as ends in ourselves, as ends in themselves. We're not simply means. And when you look at the transactional nature of so much of what is built now in the digital world, that recapturing of a more humane view of our place in the digital ecosystem is absolutely essential. And one of the reasons why I've been so very excited to be involved in the development of the Institute for Ethics in AI, which has recently appointed its first director, John Tsoulis, is located in the Faculty of Philosophy and is exactly about trying to bring these questions to the fore, to work out what the proper balance is between our human interests and the technology that we have developed and that is developing ever faster and that we need to understand the consequences of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel, for that absolutely fascinating talk. The questions are coming in already. I have to say it makes me enormously grateful to be here in Oxford. I see that John Tsoulis is in the audience for your talk, and it is just marvellous to be able to talk to people who understand the tech and the ethics and get them to talk to each other. And you know, as a mere lawyer, I'm very grateful to be involved in these conversations. So thank you. I'm going to start. Participants, please feel free to put in more questions into the Q&A function if you want to. Nigel, I'm going to start with a question that a couple of people have asked. I'm going to try and amalgamate the question, but some people have said, well, look, a lot of machines took a while or several versions of themselves to fine tune and perfect themselves. How far do you think we are along that road? Are we at the limits of AI development, or what do you think about the idea of an intelligence explosion?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Well, the last bit here is on how transformative do you expect that to be, using whatever metric you think.
Yeah. I think what I try and emphasize in this is the assembly of AI we have at the moment. The deployment of AI illustrates something very striking, which is that these are all, and in the best cases, very narrow task achieving capabilities. So we have systems that are superhuman in their ability to discriminate faces and identify them, that are capable of doing extraordinary things in reading lips, for example, or diagnosing skin lesions. But they are programmed for specific tasks, and those objective functions, the tasks we give them, are ones that we as humans give to the systems, and they can variously be set up to achieve to a very high level in these particular narrow areas. And the question is, does that give you the beginnings of any confidence that you understand anything about a general theory of intelligence? And that is still an extremely long way away. We don't know what the constituents of that are. So what we have is something that is much more pervasive, much more ubiquitously distributed, and has become routine. So the fact that a Siri assistant can recognize my voice and actually offer up answers to questions I put to it is a triumph of a very narrow sort of engineering to a particular set of data. And it is not the case, although of course the human tendency to anthropomorphize into that and imagine that, you know, there is something intentional and reflective on the other end is very great indeed. I think we're still a very long way away from that. Rather, what we're seeing is something I think of as augmented intelligence. We have this distribution of smarts in many niches in our environment. So the speciation of AI is literally thousands of small apps that do specific things, and the integration of those, this idea that they can somehow assemble and become something that is much greater than the individual components, that is still deeply elusive.
I'm getting quite a lot of questions, which I think are very important questions about the ethical issues that AI raises, whether these are the kinds of ethical issues that have arisen in relation to other technologies or new ones, and a particular question in the context of that, about whether you think, well, how you think we should educate ourselves really about those ethical issues.
Well, this is music to my ears. I mean, this is one of the reasons, of course, that we were so keen to establish the Institute and get this program, this notion of AI ethics in place. And now, you know, there are a lot of programs being talked around the place. It's no accident, I think, that lots and lots of ethical codes have been promoted in advance for how AI should manage itself. When we look at those, what's clear is that they have a lot of family resemblances. But the real question is, if you're going to put AI ethics on a serious footing, it's going to require some serious conceptualization. We often use the analogy, and it works to some extent quite well, of medical ethics. When medicine was advancing to the point at which new sorts of therapy and new sorts of technology were available, you began to get really interesting dilemmas that had this moral dimension. And medical ethics was partly born out of philosophers, for example, getting seized with the question of fairness, or the question of certainty, or the questions around consent. So informed consent came from that pressure for an ethical relationship, a rebalancing the relationship between the practitioner and the patient, the professional and the patient. The notion of resource allocation came to the fore when technologies like dialysis, kidney dialysis, meant this very scarce resource. How did you make it accessible to a broader range of individuals in a population who might need it? And this just came with a ton of considerations, concept of futility of care. And what we think is that this is exactly analogous. People now, we're building systems that materially impact our lives, systems that are being given decision-making roles in our lives are going to absolutely raise these ethical questions. And we must find a means to do the serious reflection on what those questions are and what reasonable solutions might be, but also the literacy, the teaching of this, with more and more people recruiting these methods into their toolkits for building their technologies. We need awareness from the point of view of the engineers and the computer scientists, but also those working in the humanities, working in the social sciences, people working as social data scientists. What are the ethical challenges, and how do we construct a curriculum that moves us into these questions in the 21st century? What does the what does the PPE revolution need to look like to embrace these kinds of issues?
Yeah. Okay. And I wonder whether you think how we're going to get those kinds of ethical debates out to policymakers. I've, as you will expect, got a number of questions about how we would avoid the off-call algorithm issue arising again. There is this difficult question about how we get those kind of ethical questions being asked in this sort of forum into the policy devising process, and indeed the algorithm devising process.
Yeah, and the whole issue of accountability and contextualization of that algorithm in a social context. I mean, I think there are so many lessons to learn, both in the current crisis and some of the recent missteps that point out to the fact that this was nothing to do with a mutant algorithm. This was actually decisions made about how you might manage a process, which turned out, given the edge cases, and to be fundamentally indefensible. So, and there the argument about whether the algorithm was wrong or whether the statistical modeling was wrong, it's much more about whether the interests of individuals who were in some sense fell foul of this algorithm were being taken into account, and how could you possibly promote a system in which many of those individual injustices were seen to be happening. And I think that very much is the question of accountability. We do have to always think about how we can place our systems as they're engineered into that accountability context. So as we're designing them, how do we ensure that process is one that's responsive and reflexive to the challenges that we have to be aware of the context of deployment, and whether it's in bail setting or credit rating or exam ranking, they're not beyond an appreciation of what the sorts of interests should be. So we just have to make sure that we have a reasonably rigorous way of walking ourselves through the use cases, the limit cases, the edge cases, and so on. That's what we do with safety critical systems. We ought to be able to do it in our more routine engineering.
Yeah, and I do think one of the dangers is that because people don't necessarily understand the tech and what's going on, they forget that these are machines making the correlations that somebody has programmed them to make, and they forget that this is predictive. We're saying from these past patterns, what do we predict will happen in the future? But how much of the past patterns do we want to reproduce? How much of them do we think is valid? I mean, I think it's a very interesting point. And John Sulis has asked you a question, which is a difficult one, of course, but he says you spoke about the Kantian principle, the moral principle of treating people always as ends in themselves, not just a means. And which of the domains in which you think AI most threatens this principle, and what do you think we can do to mitigate those? And just to say that is a question that encompasses a number of other questions I've been asked, for example, about unfairness at work and other issues.
Yeah. And of course, in that sense, the analysis you're going to go through is not dissimilar than any other technological insertion that threatens to make decisions or classify according to particular models. I mean, we've been doing credit rating for decades, using nothing as fancy as a modern machine learning method, as simple forms of regression, statistical analysis, and so on. And we became worried in an age of big data that we would not be observing deceptive and discriminatory practices where they were working, where we suddenly recognized that entire subgroups of the population were being systematically denied access to credit, or in this case, perhaps to appropriate and fair sentencing regimes. So it seems that we do have to think about, well, the as if appeal is an interesting one here. When you look at the algorithm and you apply the question, which is, are we happy in the context the way this is performing, that there is enough contextualization, that there is enough recognition, that there are interests that are over and above simple nostrums of utilitarian efficiency, or simple functions that equate to savings for the organization, or better levels of precision in making the scoring. All decision making, and they see this in the appeals process you'd be familiar with, of course, in your world, is much more nuanced than that. It puts the deliberation into a much deeper socio legal context, and that's the bit that's missing. And I think to simply, well, we had a fascinating discussion around the principle that, well, of course, human decision making is so error prone in some cases that the algorithm can actually, in some cases, provably do better than some of the arbitrary decision making that humans make. But that's where the argument is. That's where the decision is if that's what's revealed, then you have your argument about that process and how you can improve the embedding of human and machine decision making together. And I think a thing I would just like to say in conclusion of this point is, it's that hybrid, it's that social machine, that integration and interweaving of human and machine capability that offers the promise to kind of simply remove one element in this unthinking way is deeply dangerous.
I'm getting quite a lot of questions about oversight and regulation, and there's one about whether we should have ethics committees which specifically oversee AI research, and perhaps linked to that, a question about the links that the Oxford AI Centre has with large Chinese or perhaps American AI companies, and is there a global AI ethics debate that we need to have?
There has to be. I mean, the idea that, well, of course, there are different narratives around all of this. I mean, and you hear this in some of the political statements from leaders in certain nation states who talk about sovereign AI capability. You know, that, and of course, again, you can look back on history and see all sorts of examples, literally, of arms races in technologies and capabilities. The notion that that can just carry on unimpeded, it has to be the case, and this is where ethics, regulation, governance start to converge around questions. Is it, what kind of reasonable behavior is it to constantly attack each other's cyber infrastructure in this 24/7 way with algorithms that are increasingly driven by AI themselves? They're adaptive, they're fast learning. This kind of undeclared war, which is kind of occurring on a daily basis, this isn't a way for nation states to behave. So there's plenty to go at when it comes to various limitation treaties and norms and good behavior in the digital space. We really haven't grown up there yet. It's a real conundrum. So where we can find multilateral organizations that might want to take this on, or where we have some hope of enforcing a degree of consensus on this, I think that's pretty important. Everybody, I think, would agree that what the solution is, because again, at the moment, there's a kind of notion that this style of AI is going to carry the day. You know, that a state that is sufficiently organized that it can gather all the data on its citizens, is going to have a better set of outcomes from one that is not. These are simple-minded analyses, I'd argue, as well, but I mean, it's certainly one where we need to understand that space of potential alignments of interest such that you can get some agreement. And this happens in other areas of technology. Why shouldn't it be something we're capable of sorting out in AI? But there's got to be a lot more attention to this for sure.
I suppose one of the answers to the why shouldn't it be possible question is the very diffuse and extremely powerful interests at play. So you're talking about, can we find a common framework for states with as different political traditions and assumptions as China and the United States and European states, to find a way through. And then, of course, there's the interests of the owners of big data and the Shadbolt thesis. And in fact, the first question I was asked, I was saving it up to come in at a particular moment, was what threat you think that surveillance capitalism may pose to the future of democracy? Because, of course, if you don't have states that can make treaties with one another or make agreements about this, we're very much in the hands of people who own the tech.
Well, that
data.
Is an extremely interesting point. You know, there has been serious concerns that we're effectively living in an age of about 20 or so East India companies, all kind of trooping around, you know, in some sense beyond the reach of individual jurisdictions. I mean, there's a lot to sort out here. You're also seeing the pushback, of course, of nation states starting to think that maybe the unbridled power of some of these platforms isn't unalloyed good. But of course, they then have a strategic interest in having that capability quartered on there in their nation state anyway. It's going to be really an important area where we can understand how, and some of this will come back to what we consent to and what we are in some sense allowing to happen in our name. I mean, I saw a question there on AI and democracy. It comes back fundamentally to the question of whether what agency we have in this world, and we have to believe we can affect agency. We have to believe that we have some degree of self-determination, and where you start on that journey, I mean, you will start with all sorts of presumptions and assumptions that we can know what's being done with the data, both at a corporate level and in the public sphere. And so there's an awful lot of infrastructure, and you say it's not just diffuse in terms of the actors. This is a particularly generic universal technology, so it's not like concentrating nuclear fission products. You know, it's not that it's not materialized in that way. So that makes some of the challenges greater. But it shouldn't be the case that we simply throw up our hands in despair and say this is nothing which we can bring back under control. It clearly is. I don't agree with those who effectively say, well, just let's freeze the clock speeds. No more development of those chips to make them faster and more able. I mean, that kind of imposition doesn't seem to be entirely plausible, at all plausible. But the notion of task limitation, the notion of accountability and oversight, not just of the technology, but of the organizations running it, proper governance within those. And we have to look at some of the platforms and say, do we feel happy with systems that essentially try and convince us that they can self-police themselves, or that there's no real issues when the stock options are constructed in such a way that only a very few people have real material power in the governance of the organization? I do believe quite profoundly, and this is something that Tim Berners-Lee and I are beginning work on with an Oxford Martin School project, that as well as technological alternatives in this world, so we're particularly interested in re-decentralizing technologies in such a way that data doesn't always have to end up aggregated and concentrated in one place. There are institutional architectures that have to be developed to support and sustain these new digital possibilities we're living in. So what do data cooperatives look like? What do various forms of mutualization of code look like?
Yeah, I find that data cooperative ownership question a very interesting one. and one that I struggle quite hard to conceptualize. Another way of looking at it, I suppose, and a question that we've had in terms of accountability is, and this one's aimed at us both because I'm slightly back on more onto home turf on this, but I'm going to let you answer it first, is how in institutional, I suppose, legal terms, you impose accountability, and particularly can you do it by deciding where you impose liability for the consequences of decisions made by AI, product liability for defective design. I mean, the prior question, it seems to me, is how do you know about the defective design? Because you don't know how the intelligent machine is learning from itself, and that's where, as a politician, I struggle to kind of get to an answer. But I do think it might be the way we need to look at it.
But there's a whole area of AI which is looking to try and work out how, with these, particularly with these super powerful deep neural networks, you can have alongside them rule-based characterizations of their behavior. So these kind of accountable systems are meant to hold up more systematic explanations of why they are behaving in the way they are. So and that is a fair, accountable and transparent machine learning is that whole area of development. So trying to get inside the black box and trying to have some adequate characterization of how outcomes were determined, and there'll be a variety of ways of offering up explanations. It might be to do with the representational distribution of the training sets it was exposed to learn the outcomes it did. It might be in terms of appeals to particular cases that are similar to the case that's being adjudicated by the system right now. And I think that's definitely an area where we can see the broader range of AI methods. And this isn't in principle more complicated than what's happened in various areas of software engineering, where validation and verification of the performance of the system is kind of crucial. You really have to have some confidence that you can know that the system is behaving in a way that A, you intended, and B, that it claims to be doing in its own design characterization. Now, there are real complexities in some of the AI systems. That's understood, but it's not hopeless. People have even appealed to the idea of a kind of AI neuroscience, where you actually have to go in and develop new sorts of instrumentation to understand the behavior of the system as an overall artifact. But this is definitely an area where there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I find that interesting because I do think if you're going to have an accountability mechanism, there has to be some duty, A, for you to address the questions that society wants you to address about whatever it is you're creating, and those are not necessarily the same in America or China as they are here.
No, I think that you'll see the difference.
And explain it, yeah. And to explain it so that you can be held accountable through whatever mechanism the law thinks is appropriate. But there is a question here about whether explainable AI is an illusion or it can be attained. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think for different technologies are scrutable in different ways, and we are clearly working hard at the moment with a new generation of methods to understand their behavior sufficiently well that we can be much more confident about the limitations and strengths of those systems. And I think that's to the extent that people working in so-called formal verification methods are looking at how you can use these methods in a neural network setting. And it's a substantial technological and computational challenge, but it's one that's being taken up by the field. And again, within all of that, there is the whole question of if the route to explanation is so complicated, what's the reasonable kind of expectation? But again, in some sense, we've always had that problem with human decision making. We've often convinced ourselves there was much more rigor than has been apparent, whereas with our machines, we hold them to a higher standard of accountability, as we must, and as we should. I think there's no question of that.
Well, they're more powerful, so we need to.
Well, if we delegate these tasks to them, I mean, as we do in everything from pilot assistance, you bloody well want to be sure that they are operating within a well understood envelope. And when they don't, there's a huge amount of hand-wringing, and as we know, there is a huge amount of searching of where and what and who will be held liable.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last question I'm going to ask you, and I'm afraid I haven't been able to ask every question that's come up. There are a lot of questions, but I think these Zoom talks have a time limit really on how long people can keep going for. But this is very interesting and generating a lot of debate. I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway, whether you think there is, given these complexities, you think that we should still be pushing STEM education, i.e. science, technology, engineering and maths, or whether we should be emphasizing STEAM and including the arts in the core curriculum and the ideas we should be learning about as well.
Well, you know, I'd have to sort of put my vote in for that broader discipline as possible. I mean, you know, and again, in some sense, Oxford's been the place where, as new forms of accounting for the world have come along, it's trying to incorporate them. So yeah, full steam ahead, I would say. I mean, I think it is absolutely, the question is how you accommodate within these overfull curricula a meaningful experience, and how you develop curricula where there is meaningful engagement between those who do not intend to spend their life coding, but may well end up regulating, and those who will be building systems, but aren't going to be spending their life on philosophical legal jurisprudence. And that's a really interesting challenge, and it's one that we're trying to make some headway again with in the Institute. And there was an interesting seminar just yesterday on the practicalities of teaching these courses educationally at this moment to students who are, there's a real appetite on I say the two cultures, but all of the cultures, whether it's social science, medical science, engineering science, physical and life sciences, and the humanities. This transfer has never been, it's never been a richer nexus of questions, I would say.
Well, yeah, huge.
I saw one question, I've got to answer one question I saw on the chat, if you don't mind. What this thing about, you know, what about taxing the
oh yes, well, for financial means, yeah, go on.
Absolutely, yeah. Right. And I do think that we have no decent method of rendering the huge amounts of value that are being extracted, this new class of extractive industries. We have got to work out how we get better distributional models, and tax ought to be part of that. And but it is anathema for some people to end up talking like that. But of course, we've precisely understood that in the past. Of course, this, in some sense, the curious feature of this extraordinary, powerful increase in content and capability is working out where you can levy appropriate taxation on its outputs. Yeah.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to have to do one final one as well. There's one practical question: will the slides be shared? This talk is recorded, so it will go up on the Mansfield College website, and you'll be able to download it and look at the slides and the talk again. But from the same person, it's a fantastic question: whether how you can integrate human intervention and AI when you are designing products or companies or whatever you're doing, and is there any best practice, or how might we develop a best practice for that? So that's the question, really.
A super question. Work in progress, I'd say. I mean, certainly part of the work that I and colleagues have been involved in is this whole issue. Tim calls it the social machine, you know, how you integrate human and machine capabilities. And often it seems we haven't got an exact design science. It almost feels like it's speciation, it's Darwinian. You know, you see these emergent systems where often very, very simple principles are recruited at scale, and suddenly you have this new opportunity. You see it time and time again in the web at scale, with data at scale. But doing that in a way that is sensitive to the human creative capability and what satisfies us, and not simple narrow monopolies or indeed nation states. That's the trick. Yeah.
Okay, well, Nigel, thank you. You really do combine the ability to explain these things in an incredibly human way and real deep understanding of the technology. So thank you very much for sparing your time to talk to us. And as I say, this will be recorded and available on the Mansfield College website. I think it's a YouTube channel, but anyway, you'll be able to find it through the Mansfield College website a little while after this talk has ended. Please, if you'd like to hear about the other speakers we have this term, feel free to sign up. You can send daniel.hall@mansfield.ox.ac.uk and we'll be added to the mailing list, and we'll send you links to the talks that we have. We've got some fantastic speakers later on this term. Next week at the same time, we will have Justice Brian Preston, who is the lead judge of the New South Wales Environmental Court, talking about climate justice and law. And he will be taking questions and answers, although as it will be the middle of the night, he will be taking them after the talk. But do please join us for that one or any future talks. But in the meantime, Nigel, thank you very, very much. That was absolutely fantastic. And Dan has put his email address up on the chat if anyone wants to take that down. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.